Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're looking at a pretty intense period. Idi Amin Dada's rule in Uganda, running from 71 to 79.
Yeah, it's a time marked by, well, extreme brutality, but also a lot of controversy. We've gathered a lot of material to try and unpack it.
Right, and our goal here is really to get to the heart of his reign, understand its key features, and, why it still resonates today.
Exactly. It's a story that needs careful handling, looking at the impact on Uganda.
Absolutely. And Amin himself, what a character. He had these grandiose titles, didn't he?
Yeah.
Like Conqueror of the British Empire.
Oh, yeah. And President for Life, things like that.
It's such a stark contrast, those titles versus the horrifying reality of his leadership.
It really is. Those titles were part of this carefully constructed, almost bizarre public image, a cult of personality.
Definitely. Okay, so before the titles, where did he come from? Humble beginnings, right?
Yeah, born in a small village, he joined the British colonial army back in 1946.
And he rose through the ranks pretty fast.
He did, yeah. Became a sergeant major, and even back then, apparently there were, well, let's call them foreshadowings, hints of the brutality to come.
So that military background is key.
Definitely shaped him. And he was involved in the independence struggle, too, in the 60s.
Which was a pretty chaotic time for Uganda, politically speaking, after independence in 62.
Very unstable. Yeah, that post-independence period, lots of power struggles, political turmoil. It really set the scene.
For someone like Amin to step in.
Precisely. The conditions were, you could say, ripe for it.
And then came the coup, 1971.
That's right. Milton Obote, the president at the time, was out of the country at a conference in Singapore.
And Amin saw his chance.
He did. Launched a military coup d'etat. It was swift, decisive, and really born out of that existing power struggle and general unrest.
A classic military takeover.
Textbook example, really. A sudden, illegal seizure of power. Showed his ambition early on.
So, okay, he grabs power. What's the first thing he does?
He moves fast, really fast, to consolidate his authority.
And not through, building consensus.
No, it was primarily through fear. Violence, intimidation, that was the main tool.
Wow. Just dismantling opposition right away?
Exactly. Establishing his dominance very quickly and very brutally.
And then came that cult of personality we mentioned, those titles. Last King of Scotland. Where did that come from?
Pure self-aggrandizement. It tells you so much about his ego, doesn't it?
It really does. And state propaganda just ran with it, portraying him as a liberator.
Oh, absolutely. The narrative was he freed Uganda from colonialism. He's the nation's savior. Standard authoritarian playbook in a way.
But amplified, it sounds like.
Definitely amplified. And that image was crucial, especially early on, to justify what he was doing.
And then 1977, he makes it official. President for life.
Yeah. That declaration really hammered it home. No more pretense of democracy or limited terms. This was absolute control.
And he built his control on loyalty, right? Particularly from his own ethnic group.
Very much so. He relied heavily on loyalists, and yes, especially from his own Kakwa ethnic background.
The policies started favoring his supporters.
Absolutely, which naturally created huge divisions within the country. Deep resentment among other ethnic groups who felt marginalized or targeted.
Which brings us to the darkest part. The reign of terror. The human rights abuses.
This is really the core of his legacy, unfortunately. Widespread violence, constant fear. Just horrific abuses.
The numbers. Estimates are around 300,000 executions.
That's the figure most cited, yes. Around 300,000 people killed during his 8 years.
Just let that sink in. And who were the targets?
Anyone seen as a threat. Political opponents, of course, but also intellectuals, judges, military officers suspected of disloyalty, religious leaders, and, as we mentioned, specific ethnic minorities.
They're systematic.
Very, and carried out with extreme brutality. He had his personal army, the Loyalists, who were notorious.
What kind of tactics are we talking about?
Extrajudicial killings were common, targeting not just individuals, but their families, too. Widespread torture. Secret police forces operating with impunity.
So the general population lived in constant fear.
Constant fear. Arbitrary arrests, beatings, public executions. It created this pervasive atmosphere of terror. Nobody felt safe. That kind of fear, it doesn't just disappear when the regime falls, it lingers, erodes trust.
I can only imagine. Then there was the expulsion of the Asians in 1972. That was huge.
A massive event. Around 60,000 people, mainly of Indian and Pakistani origin, forced out, often with just the clothes on their backs.
What was his justification for that?
He accused them of economic exploitation, called them foreign masters, draining the country's wealth. It was framed as economic nationalism.
Kind of a populist move, playing on resentment.
Exactly. But the economic consequences were catastrophic.
Because they controlled a lot of the economy.
Huge parts of it, retail, trade, small industries, they were the entrepreneurial backbone in many ways.
So kicking them out just tanked the economy.
Pretty much overnight. You had severe shortages of basic goods, businesses collapsing left and right, inflation soaring, unemployment spiking, foreign investment dried up completely.
Wow. A self-inflicted wound of incredible proportions.
Absolutely. It shows the danger of policies driven by, prejudice and populism rather than any sound economic logic. The impact was devastating and lasted for decades.
It wasn't just the expulsion, right? His other policies didn't exactly help the economy either.
Not at all. Despite all the rhetoric about self-reliance, his rule saw a steep economic decline overall.
How so? Beyond the expulsion.
Well, there was rampant corruption. Misappropriation of public funds was standard practice. Foreign aid often just vanished or was squandered.
And Amin himself lived pretty lavishly.
Oh, yes. Huge spending on the military, on personal palaces, extravagant projects, while basic infrastructure, roads, hospitals, schools just crumbled.
So corruption, mismanagement, and then the international isolation must have picked in too.
Definitely. His erratic behavior, the inflammatory statements supporting rogue regimes, it alienated almost everyone.
Diplomatic ties cut, foreign businesses leaving.
All of the above. Uganda became increasingly isolated, which just squeezed the economy even further. Cut off trade, aid, investment.
It's a bleak picture. And we need to talk more about the torture, the sheer brutality of the state apparatus.
Yes, it was systematic. Detention centers were notorious. Appalling conditions, routine torture.
The details that have emerged are just sickening.
Truly horrific. Mutilation of the victims was common. Bodies often dumped in rivers like the Nile or in mass graves. Just utter disregard for human life and dignity.
And this brutality wasn't just for show. It was deeply tied to Amin's paranoia.
Absolutely. As his rule went on, his paranoia seemed to grow. He saw plots everywhere.
Leading to purges, even within his own inner circle.
Yes. Purges within the military, within the government. High-ranking officials, even those once close to him, could be accused of thwarting and executed. Sometimes, reportedly, by Amin himself.
So that fear we talked about earlier, it extended right to the top.
Pervasive fear. Nobody was immune from the potential for arbitrary arrest, torture, or execution.
And the military was the instrument of this fear, but also a source of instability for Amin himself.
Exactly. The military kept him in power, suppressed dissent brutally, but he never fully trusted them.
Why not?
Well, he came to power via a coup, so he was always wary of someone doing the same to him. His relationship with his officers was volatile, lots of suspicion.
So he kept shuffling them around.
Constantly replacing officers, especially in key positions. And as we said, increasingly favoring people from his own Kakwa ethnic group, hoping that would ensure loyalty.
Which probably just destabilized things further.
It did. Constant turnover, ethnic bias.
Right.
Didn't create a stable or professional military force.
And layered on top of all this was Amin's own unpredictability.
Utterly erratic. Sudden policy changes seemingly on a whim. Nationalizing industries one day, changing course the next, passing harsh laws against intellectuals, against religious groups.
With little thought for the consequences.
Apparently not. It created this climate of chaos. Impossible to plan, impossible to govern effectively, just constant instability driven by his whims.
So by the late 1970s, what's the state of Uganda?
It's essentially a failed state. Racked by internal conflict, the economy totally destroyed, isolated internationally. The regime was crumbling from within and facing pressure from outside.
External pressure, like from Tanzania.
Yes. Tensions with Tanzania escalated into open conflict. The Ugandan army, weakened by purges and mismanagement, suffered major defeats.
And there was a rebellion forming.
A growing rebellion of Ugandan exiles, crucially backed by the Tanzanian military. They started making serious headway.
And that was the end for Amin.
That was the tipping point. In April 1979, after prolonged fighting and with Kampala under threat, Amin fled the country.
Leaving behind chaos.
Utter devastation. A country scarred physically, economically, psychologically.
And he himself never faced justice.
Never. He found asylum first in Libya, then eventually settled in Saudi Arabia, lived there until his death in 2003.
Wow. So looking back, what is the legacy? It sounds overwhelmingly negative, but is there any other side to it?
Well, it's still debated, believe it or not. Some supporters, though few, try to frame him as an anti-imperialist figure, someone who stood up for African pride.
But that's hard to square with the facts, isn't it?
Extremely hard. The overwhelming evidence points to horrific, large-scale human rights abuses. The sheer scale of the killing and suffering under his rule really overshadows any attempt to paint him positively.
The human cost.
Yeah.
Hundreds of thousands dead, an economy ruined.
Exactly. The international community largely condemned him, though he did have some allies, like Gaddafi's Libya for a time.
And Uganda's recovery?
Long and incredibly difficult. The country struggled for decades with the consequences, the ethnic divisions he exacerbated, the economic collapse, the political instability. The scars run deep.
So summing up this deep dive, Amin's rule is just a chilling case study, isn't it?
It really is. A stark example of unchecked power, personal ego running rampant, and the absolutely devastating impact of brutal dictatorship.
The human cost is almost unimaginable, and the damage to Uganda's development was profound and long-lasting.
It really underscores how fragile democracy and human rights can be, and why holding leaders accountable is so vital.
Absolutely. And it leaves you thinking, doesn't it, about the international response, or sometimes the lack of response, to regimes like his. What's our collective responsibility when tyranny takes hold?
That's a crucial question. How does the world react, and does that reaction shape future events? It's something worth pondering.
Definitely food for thought. And perhaps encourages listeners to look into survivor stories or the wider context of 1970s Africa. Well, thanks for joining us on this difficult but important deep dive. Nelson Mandela. The name itself, it's iconic, isn't it? Synonymous with liberation, the fight against apartheid in South Africa.
Absolutely, a global symbol.
But, beyond that celebrated image, there's a much more complex story. Lots of difficult choices, compromises, and, well, quite a bit of controversy.
Which is often the case with figures who operate on such a massive historical stage.
Exactly. So welcome to the deep dive. Today we're aiming to look beyond that standard narrative. We want to get into some of those less explored areas of Mandela's life, his politics, his presidency.
Looking at the criticisms, the compromises, it doesn't diminish the figure. I think it actually enriches our understanding. It makes it more real.
Totally agree. It's about understanding the human element, the context of the decisions. So where should we start? Maybe his early days in the ANC.
Good place. Because initially his focus was very much on nonviolent protest, following in the footsteps of people like Gandhi to some extent.
Right. But then came 1961 and a really significant shift. The co-founding of Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK, the armed wing of the ANC.
Yeah, and this wasn't just a minor tactical adjustment. This was huge. They started carrying out acts of sabotage against government installations.
And that decision, it wasn't universally popular, was it? Even among supporters?
Not at all. It was deeply controversial. You had early supporters who felt it was a betrayal of the nonviolent principles they had signed up for.
Alienated some people.
Definitely. And internationally, too, advocates for peaceful change were concerned, to say the least. Plus, of course, it meant direct military confrontation with the state.
So was the debate framed as him abandoning his principles, or more like a necessary evil, a pragmatic response to brutal state oppression?
That's precisely the core of the debate, isn't it? Supporters would argue, quite forcefully, that the apartheid regime had closed off all peaceful avenues. State violence was escalating.
They felt they had no choice.
Exactly. That targeted sabotage was the only way left to respond, to show resistance. But critics, then and now, point to the ethical issues, the risk of civilian harm, even unintended harm, and argue it undermined the movement's moral authority.
Which sort of leads us into the next major chapter, the Rivonia trial. His arrest in 62, the trial in 64.
Right, and then the sentence, 27 years in prison.
And paradoxically, it's during that imprisonment that he becomes this, global symbol of resistance, an icon recognized everywhere.
It's true. His imprisonment galvanized international condemnation of apartheid like almost nothing else could.
But even as his symbolic status grew, that earlier decision about MK, the armed struggle, that continued to be a point of criticism for some, right?
Oh, definitely. The argument resurfaced, especially when discussing the MK's bombing campaigns, questions about whether they caused unnecessary harm, whether civilians were put at risk. It remained a contentious aspect of his legacy for some.
And what about within the ANC itself during those long years he was inside? Was everything unified around him?
Well, no, not entirely. I mean, having your leader imprisoned obviously creates huge challenges. Sources suggest there were internal divisions, disagreements about strategy.
Even questions about some of his earlier decisions.
Yeah. Yes, precisely. Leadership on the outside had to navigate the day-to-day struggle, the shifting political landscape. There were different factions, different ideas about the best way forward, especially as the years went by.
Which brings us neatly to the 1980s. The pressure on the apartheid regime is mounting, both internally and internationally.
Huge pressure. Sanctions were biting, internal resistance was strong.
And the idea of maybe a negotiated settlement starts to gain some traction. But was there a debate about whether Mandela from prison should have maybe engaged earlier?
Oh, absolutely. That was a really significant debate. You had this tension, this difficult balance. On one hand, the escalating violence and suffering made talks seem urgent, potentially life-saving.
A way to stop the bloodshed.
Right. But on the other hand, many felt Mandela's unwavering stance, his refusal to compromise with the regime while imprisoned, was crucial. Engaging too early, they feared, might legitimize apartheid or weaken their position.
So holding firm was seen as maintaining moral high ground and pressure.
Exactly. While others were arguing, look at the cost. Couldn't talks have started sooner? It's a classic dilemma in liberation struggles.
And when he did eventually agree to talks, first secret ones, then more openly, leading up to his release, that itself was a massive compromise, wasn't it? And one that drew fire.
It absolutely was a watershed moment. But yes, immediately criticisms emerged. Some felt that he and the ANC negotiating team conceded too much.
Specifically regarding what?
Primarily around protections for white South Africans, economic interests, property rights, positions in the civil service. The argument was that these concessions were necessary to ensure a peaceful transition and avoid civil war.
Which is a very real fear.
A terrifyingly real fear. But critics felt these compromises didn't secure enough concrete guarantees for the black majority, especially on really fundamental issues.
Like land, economic justice.
Exactly. Land redistribution, meaningful affirmative action, ways to fundamentally shift the economic power imbalance. The question lingered. Were those foundational issues adequately addressed in the compromises made during the transition?
And that links directly to the post-1994 era, his presidency, and those really quite potent sellout accusations, especially around economic policy.
Yes, this is still a hugely debated topic in South Africa. Mandela's focus on reconciliation was, central to his presidency, bringing a divided nation together.
Understandably so.
But his government adopted economic policies like the gear strategy, growth, employment, and redistribution that were widely seen as, neoliberal.
Market-oriented privatization attracting foreign investment.
Precisely. And the criticism was sharp, that these policies ended up primarily benefiting the established white economic elite and a new black elite, rather than tackling the deep systemic poverty and inequality faced by the majority.
So the feeling was that the promises of the struggle, economic liberation, weren't being delivered.
That was the accusation from many corners. Significant anger flared up within the ANC itself, certainly among its allies in the trade unions and the Communist Party. They felt the government was prioritizing pleasing international markets and investors over the needs of its core constituency.
A betrayal, essentially, in their eyes.
For some, yes. They saw it as favoring foreign capital, multinational corporations, and failing to deliver the radical economic transformation they believed the anti-apartheid struggle had promised. It felt like a perpetuation of inequality, just under a new flag.
Okay, another key piece of this transition puzzle was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC.
Ah, the TRC. Such a unique and still controversial experiment.
Its goal was healing, right? Perpetrators and victims coming forward. Amnesty for truth.
That was the idea, a mechanism to deal with the horrors of the past without endless cycles of revenge or trials that could destabilize the new democracy. Perpetrators could apply for amnesty if they gave a full, truthful account of politically motivated crimes.
But the criticism was that it let perpetrators off too easily, especially those from the state security forces.
That's the major criticism, yes. Many victims and their families felt that amnesty, even in exchange for truth, was not justice. It denied them accountability for torture, for murder, for disappearances.
So this tension between reconciliation and justice, it was right at the heart of the TRC.
Absolutely. A profound and perhaps unresolvable tension. Did the need for national unity and stability outweigh the individual's right to see perpetrators punished in court? The TRC prevented widespread retribution, maybe, but it left many feeling that justice was sacrifice.
And some sources suggest it might have also been seen as perhaps a political tool to legitimize the new ANC government, draw a line under the past without fully grappling with the accountability aspect.
That perspective exists, certainly. that it served a political function in stabilizing the transition, but maybe at the cost of deeper, more difficult reckoning with the past abuses of power by the apartheid state. It's still debated fiercely.
And throughout all this, the negotiations, the economic policy, the TRC Mandela was leading the ANC, which wasn't a monolithic bloc, was it?
Not at all. The ANC has always been a broad church, a wide spectrum of ideologies. Moderates, communists, trade unionists, African nationalists, revolutionaries.
So his compromises, trying to navigate that middle path, must have upset different factions within his own party.
Constantly. You had elements, particularly from the left, the SACP, the unions, who felt he wasn't pushing hard enough. They wanted a much more radical transformation.
More state intervention, faster redistribution.
Yes. They felt his approach was too conciliatory, too focused on appeasing the white minority, the business community, the international powers. The accusation was that he wasn't leveraging the ANC's victory enough to fundamentally remake society.
So the unifying global figure was also dealing with accusations of, well, being too moderate from within his own ranks.
Exactly. That just highlights the incredible pressures he was under, juggling these vastly different expectations and trying to hold together a very fragile peace and a new democracy.
Let's shift gears slightly to the personal side. Because while Mandela's resilience was admired, his personal life wasn't without its own controversies, particularly involving Winnie Madikizela Mandela.
Right. Their marriage was initially this powerful symbol of the struggle, of enduring love despite separation and persecution.
She was mother of the nation for a time.
She absolutely was. But later, especially in the late 80s and early 90s, their relationship became incredibly strained, and Winnie herself became embroiled in very serious controversies.
Allegations of violence, corruption, the Mandela United Football Club scandal.
Yes, very serious allegations and subsequent legal troubles. This created a stark and very public contrast with Nelson Mandela's image of peace, integrity, and reconciliation. It was a huge challenge for him, personally and politically.
And their eventual divorce in 1996. That was a difficult public affair.
Extremely. And given Winnie's own continued, often quite radical political activism and the charges she faced, Mandela's decision to distance himself publicly, well, it raised questions for some.
Questions about loyalty, perhaps, given their shared history.
Some interpreted it that way. Others saw it as a necessary, though painful, decision by a leader needing to uphold certain standards of conduct and protect the integrity of the new government. It shows how tangled the personal and political became.
And finally, one last major controversy during his presidency. The arms deal. Late 1990s.
Ah, yes. The Strategic Defense Package, a massive government contract to re-equip the military.
And it became mired in allegations of corruption, didn't it? Kickbacks to officials.
Huge allegations involving high-ranking figures, multinational arms companies. It became a major scandal that has rumbled on for years.
Now, Mandela himself wasn't directly implicated in taking bribes or anything like that.
No, his personal integrity wasn't really questioned in that regard, but the criticism focused on his administration's handling of the deal and the subsequent investigation, or lack thereof.
Concerns about transparency. Governance.
Exactly. Critics argued that his government didn't act decisively enough to investigate the allegations, to hold powerful people accountable. The perception was that, perhaps to protect the party or certain individuals, the response lacked transparency and rigor.
So, even if not personally corrupt, there were questions about whether he should have taken a stronger stand against the alleged corruption happening under his watch.
That was the essence of the criticism, that it potentially compromised the principles of clean governance that were so crucial for the new South Africa, and that he, as president, should have ensured a more thorough and independent inquiry.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear, isn't it? The story of Nelson Mandela is so much more than just the heroic myth.
It really is. The controversies, the compromises, the criticisms we've touched on. They don't erase his monumental achievements. Far from it.
No, but they add layers, complexity. They give us a fuller picture of the man and the incredibly difficult circumstances he was navigating.
It shows the real-world challenges of leadership during a period of massive, almost unprecedented transformation. The choices weren't easy, and the consequences were profound.
Which leads us to a question, really, for you listening. How do you see Mandela in light of all this? Was he ultimately a pragmatist who understood that compromise, even painful compromise, was necessary to achieve that bigger goal of a democratic, non-racial South Africa?
Or did he, perhaps at certain moments, fall short of the incredibly high ideals he represented for so many for so long? Did the compromises sometimes go too far?
It's not an easy question.
Thank
There are
you.
no simple answers. It's something to really think about.
Definitely.
And maybe the final thought to leave you with is this. How do we generally reconcile these heroic narratives we build around transformative figures with well, the often messy, complex, sometimes morally ambiguous realities of their actual decisions and actions?
That's a challenge that goes way beyond just Mandela, doesn't it? It's about how we understand history, leadership, and change itself.
Something to keep mulling over. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. Okay, let's unpack this. Zimbabwe.
Right. It was once hailed as the breadbasket of Africa. Quite a reputation.
A real beacon of hope, wasn't it? Especially right after independence.
But under Robert Mugabe, it became, well, a pretty stark illustration of something else.
Yeah, how unchecked power and corruption can just dismantle a nation.
Absolutely.
You've shared some incredible material here, and I think in this deep dive, our mission is really to trace that whole transformation.
From hero to something quite different.
Exactly. Mugabe's rise, the way corruption sort of crept in, subtly at first.
And then maybe not so subtly.
Right. And those power struggles near the end that, seal his legacy.
It's fascinating because his initial standing, as you said, was really as a liberation hero, a symbol.
Against racial inequality after years of white minority rule.
Precisely. And the sources, they really detail his pivotal role in ZANU, the Zimbabwe African National Union.
Which later merged with ZAPU.
That's right, forming ZANU-PF, the Zimbabwe African National Union Patriotic Front, a really powerful force.
And that led to independence in 1980. A landmark moment.
That's it.
And that early narrative, it's just filled with promise, isn't it?
It really is. You see the implementation of policies like land redistribution.
Things that seem positive, and big steps in education, healthcare.
Concrete actions, yeah. Things pointing towards a flourishing future.
Economically, too, the sources suggest things were relatively stable, even good relations with the West.
Surprisingly positive engagement, yes. It's, almost jarring to compare that initial period with what Zimbabwe became later.
It really makes you wonder, how does a leader who starts with such a strong mandate, such a positive trajectory,
how do they end up leading a nation down such a destructive path? It's the core question.
Yeah.
And the material starts to hint at it. Even in those early years, there's mention of a gradual centralization of power.
Within ZANU-PF itself.
Exactly. Now, maybe it was seen as necessary back then for stability right after independence.
You can see that argument, perhaps.
But it inadvertently created this environment, sort of paved the way for a more authoritarian style later on.
And that leads us then to a real turning point, around 2000, right? The land reform program.
A critical moment. The publicly stated aim was, clear enough.
Redistributing land from white commercial farmers to black Zimbabweans. Addressing historical injustices. Supposedly.
A really official line, but the sources depict a brutal reality in how it was done.
Yeah, the violence described, the forced displacement. So pretty shocking stuff in the material.
It is. The government actually encouraged land seizures by groups often called war veterans.
Right, leading to experienced farmers being kicked out, often without any legal process.
Or regard for basic human rights, it seems. And as the material highlights, this didn't go unnoticed internationally.
No, widespread condemnation. Sanctions followed, big economic consequences.
Those are huge ones.
And here's where it gets, tragically destructive for the economy itself.
The direct consequence, yeah.
That collapse of commercial agriculture, the very thing that made Zimbabwe the breadbasket.
It just imploded. The sources show a steep drop in production, loss of vital export revenue.
The pillars of the economy just crumbled.
And connecting this to the bigger picture, the land reform program wasn't just an agricultural disaster.
You mean it fueled the corruption, too?
It seems instrumental in solidifying that culture, yes. The sources clearly show Mugabe and his inner circle starting to amass, significant wealth.
While the country's economy was going downhill.
Precisely. And the system of patronage, it went beyond just giving jobs.
The state contracts mentioned in the sources.
Exactly. Inflated contracts, maybe non-competitive bids, projects of questionable value. All ways to siphon off state money.
Into the pockets of his allies. Systemic looting, basically.
It seems that way. ZANU-PF became this primary vehicle for just blatant patronage.
Loyalty was everything.
Loyalty to Mugabe got you those lucrative state contracts, powerful positions in state-owned companies.
It's a textbook case, isn't it? Exploiting political power for personal gain.
And what's really revealing is the specific mention of the Mugabe family's own business interests.
Grace Mugabe, especially.
Her involvement in agriculture, real estate, and the sources suggest wealth acquired through, let's say, potentially illicit means.
So the first family becomes this central economic and political force.
Seemingly putting their own prosperity way ahead of the nation's welfare.
And the economic mismanagement that followed, I mean, it's almost hard to believe. The hyperinflation.
Oh, the figures are staggering.
Yearly 90 trillion% peak. Prices doubling every day.
It's almost impossible for us in more stable economies to really grasp that level of chaos.
So how did the corruption directly feed into that level of mismanagement? Did the sources give specific examples?
Well, they directly link it to the corruption within state-owned enterprises, the embezzlement, the plundering of resources.
That directly hits infrastructure, jobs.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Crumbling infrastructure, massive unemployment, terrible food shortages, and then the brain drain. Skilled workers just had to leave.
A tragedy. And that economic devastation, it must have created fertile ground for dissent.
You'd expect it to, which leads us to the next phase.
As the economy worsened, the political climate got darker, more repressive.
This deep dive really highlights that increasing political repression, a deliberate, often brutal effort to crush any opposition.
And the tactics used. Pretty grim reading.
Widespread violence, yeah. Systematic intimidation, censorship. The material specifically calls out the suppression of the MDC.
The Movement for Democratic Change and its leader, Morgan Tsvangirai.
Right. And this wasn't just, political games. It was systematic violation of basic human rights.
The examples are chilling. Torture, beatings, even murders of opposition members, activists, especially around election times.
Yes. And the text doesn't shy away from the Gukurahundi massacres either, back in the 80s.
A truly horrific military campaign against the Indabel people. Thousands killed.
A brutal chapter. Yet, despite atrocities like that, Mugabe's grip on power, it held firm for decades.
Mostly through control of the military, right?
That seems key. His authority depended less on popular support or democracy and more on the state's coercive power.
Which is a critical point. That reliance on the military. It kind of foreshadows his eventual downfall, too, doesn't it?
It really does. It brings us to those final, very dramatic power struggles. Right inside ZANU-PF.
The succession battles. Who would take over after Mugabe?
Exactly. In his later years, those internal fights got really intense. You had Grace Mugabe emerging as a potential successor.
Aligning with the G40 faction, the sources call it.
Right, which created this clear and increasingly hostile rivalry with another group.
The Lacoste faction, associated with Emerson Mnangagwa.
Who was vice president then,
Yeah.
And crucially had strong ties to the military establishment.
So when Mugabe dismissed Mnangagwa in 2017, that was the trigger.
That seems to be the breaking point, yes. The catalyst for the military stepping in.
A coup, essentially, even if they didn't call it that.
A coup, in all but name, yeah. And it led directly to Mugabe finally resigning.
After 37 years. Though the sources note he claimed it was voluntary.
He did maintain that, despite the very obvious pressure from the military.
So looking back at the whole story, that transformation is just stark and deeply troubling.
From liberation hero, the initial promise,
to the architect of Zimbabwe's economic ruin and a perpetrator of really severe human rights abuses.
The country went, tragically, from being that breadbasket of Africa to a symbol of collapse, both economic and political.
The legacy is just one of profound damage. The sources really underscore that. It's not just the economy.
No, it's the deep societal fractures, too. Decades of political violence, torture, the rule of law just eroded.
And that reliance on the military you mentioned, that sets a dangerous precedent for civilian rule going forward, doesn't it?
A very dangerous precedent for the future of governance in Zimbabwe.
So what are the key takeaways for you, the listener? If you're looking for that insightful knowledge, quickly.
Well, this deep dive into Mugabe's Zimbabwe, it's a potent case study. Sobering, but potent.
On how corruption works, how it can just suffocate a country.
Exactly. How it permeates a system, chokes potential. It really highlights how fragile democratic transitions can be.
And the vital importance of accountability at every level.
Absolutely paramount.
Which leaves us, and you, with a crucial question to think about.
What are those enduring challenges for nations trying to rebuild after these long periods of corruption and authoritarianism?
Or maybe think about this. What are the subtle signs, the indicators that a leader's initial positive path might be, threatened by the corrupting pull of unchecked power?
These are the complex issues, the ripples that spread out long after the main events have passed, something to really mull over.
Okay, picture this if you can. A leader, just totally in charge for decades, iron fist kind of rule.
Right.
And all the while, he's supposedly building up this secret fortune, just almost unbelievably huge.
Yeah.
We're diving into Muammar Gaddafi's hidden financial world today. This guy who called himself the King of Kings of Africa.
And, these weren't just whispers for 40 years. There were always rumors.
Exactly.
So in this deep dive, we're looking at the reports, the actual financial dealings, the incredible sums involved.
And what happened after he fell, right? Because that's when some of this stuff started to come out.
Precisely. The chaos afterward sort of peeled back the layers a bit. So our mission really is to try and understand how he pulled this off.
How do you hide that much wealth?
And what does it all mean, this kind of secret financial empire?
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. It really all comes back to oil, doesn't it? Libya had tons of it.
Oh, absolutely. He seized power in '69 just as Libya was hitting the big time with oil.
Perfect timing for him.
You could say that. And he moved fast, nationalized the industry, so all that oil money flowed straight to the state.
But under him, the state and him were kind of the same thing, weren't they?
That's the crux of it. The lines blurred completely. That oil wealth became the bedrock of his power, his personal control, and, well, his personal fortune.
And it wasn't just about getting rich himself, was it? I mean, the whole King of Kings thing.
Yeah.
That sounds expensive.
It certainly was. He poured money into projecting influence, especially across Africa, funding revolutionary groups, bankrolling his sort of Pan-African dream.
So using Libya's money for his own political projects.
Exactly. And back home, building this massive cult of personality, that takes cash too, lots of it.
Right. So the oil money's flowing in. How does he actually, siphon it off, keep it hidden? Where did it go?
Okay. This is where it gets really intricate. Sources point to, well, a few key things. First, a whole network of secret bank accounts.
Secret how? Like numbered Swiss accounts.
Sort of, yeah. Spread across Europe, the Middle East, billions, literally billions, funneled into these accounts, deliberately kept away from, the usual financial watchdogs.
Just hiding in plain sight, almost. But why keep it secret? Was it just a giant rainy day fund for him?
Partly, maybe. Personal wealth, sure. But these accounts were also workhorses, financing political allies, buying weapons, and crucially, bribing foreign officials, governments. It was like a massive off-the-books slush fund for his global plays.
And nobody knew about these accounts. I mean, how did this eventually surface?
Well, the dam really broke after 2011. When his regime collapsed, investigators started digging.
Right, the fall of Tripoli.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And suddenly the sheer scale started to become clear. And this entity, the Libyan Investment Authority, the LIA, was right in the middle of it.
The LIA, that's the sovereign wealth that everyone talks about, isn't it? It was huge.
Oh, massive. Officially, it was managing Libya's oil surplus. Assets reported around, $67 billion, something like that? Huge investments globally. Big banks like Societe Generale, Barclays, Deutsche Bank are mentioned. But the key thing, the LIA also had these really murky connections to Gaddafi's personal stash.
So the state fund and his private piggy bank were kind of mixed up.
Very mixed up. And they used incredibly complex financial structures, layers upon layers, to hide where the money really came from and who actually owned it.
So we're definitely not talking about simple offshore accounts.
Yeah.
This was high-level financial engineering.
Absolutely. Global scale. And it wasn't just bank accounts either. Gaddafi built up a pretty staggering portfolio of real estate. Lavish stuff.
Like what? Palaces.
Think mansions on the French Riviera, big properties in London, apparently even a compound in New York City.
The compound in New York, how do you keep that quiet?
Well, maybe the ownership wasn't totally secret, but the value and the source of the funds definitely were obscured. Reports talk about hundreds of millions spent just on personal properties abroad.
Hundreds of millions.
Yeah. Plus investments in things like hotels, land, commercial buildings across Europe.
And how did he hide those? Same tricks.
Pretty much. Shell companies, offshore accounts, the usual playbook for laundering money and making assets really hard to trace back to the actual owner. These shell companies, they exist on paper in places with loose rules, specifically to hide who's behind the money.
Okay, so hidden bank accounts, luxury properties, and then there's the gold. That always sounded almost mythical. The golden vaults.
Ah, yes, the gold. That adds a whole other layer, doesn't it? He supposedly had around 143 tons of gold.
143 tons?
Yeah, that's billions of dollars worth, and a lot of it was apparently stored in secret vaults.
Actual physical gold bars? Why? Was he expecting the apocalypse or something?
Maybe. But more practically, it was probably insurance. Insurance against international sanctions, which Libya faced, repeatedly.
Right, like after Lockerbie.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it was also a hedge. If the Libyan dinar collapsed, gold holds its value. It's a classic move for regimes worried about stability. And interestingly, sources mention gold and other valuables being moved out of Libya just before the NATO intervention in 2011.
So he saw the writing on the wall.
It certainly looks like he was trying to secure assets before things went south. Moving 143 tons of gold. I mean, just think about the logistics. It really underlines the scale we're talking about.
Yeah, you don't just pop that in a suitcase. Which kind of loops back to the LIA, the Sovereign Wealth Fund. It was supposed to be managing oil money for Libya, but it sounds like it was just another tool for him.
The lines were definitely, let's say, flexible. The LIA's investments were everywhere: global markets, real estate, resources. That complexity made tracing things even harder.
And then Western governments froze its assets when he fell.
That's right. A huge chunk got frozen, essentially blocked, so Gaddafi's family or loyalists couldn't access it. The idea was maybe eventually return it to Libya.
But freezing it is one thing. Figuring out who really owned what within the LIA, that's another story.
Exactly. It shows how these huge state funds can be, well, double-edged swords under autocratic rule. On paper, they look good, diversifying assets, but they can also be used to hide and move wealth illicitly.
Right. And we mentioned this wasn't just about him living large. He used this money for influence, sometimes pretty destructively.
Oh, absolutely. Libya in the 70s and 80s, it had a reputation. Gaddafi funneled millions to various groups he supported.
Like who?
Sources mention groups like the INLA in Ireland, the PLO, the IRA. Significant financial backing.
And using those same hidden channels.
Yeah.
Banks,
Yeah.
shell companies.
Yes, that whole network. It wasn't just random payments. It was a systematic way to bypass sanctions, support allies, and frankly, cause trouble on the international stage. It shows how easily that kind of hidden wealth can fuel conflict.
It really does. And Libya got implicated in some major attacks, right? Like the Pan Am bombing over Lockerbie.
Yes, Lockerbie was a huge one. Led to major international sanctions, though. As we've seen, his financial networks were pretty resilient.
So beyond funding armed groups, what about more traditional influence peddling, using money to sway politics?
Oh, definitely. Bribery was reportedly a major part of his foreign policy toolkit.
Really?
Yeah, sources talk about these extensive networks set up specifically to offer bribes. Foreign politicians, business leaders, government officials. The goal was pretty clear.
What? Get good trade deals.
That, influence elections in other countries, get favorable votes at the UN, basically buying influence wherever he could.
It sounds incredibly calculated. A very strategic use of that hidden money.
It seems so. And it might tie into his bigger ambitions. Remember that speech he gave at the UN in 2009?
Vaguely. Wasn't it incredibly long?
Infamously long, yes. But he also proposed this idea of a new gold-backed African currency. The gold dinar.
A gold-backed currency for Africa.
Pretty radical. And some people theorize, well, that his massive hidden gold stash, that 143 tons we talked about, maybe that was intended to be the backing for this new currency.
Seriously, to challenge the dollar, the euro.
Potentially. A currency outside the control of the West, backed by his own gold. If true, you can imagine that might have worried certain global powers quite a bit. It adds another layer to why some might have wanted him gone.
Okay, so let's jump to 2011. NATO intervenes, the regime falls apart. What happens to all this wealth? Does it just evaporate?
Not all of it. Western governments did manage to freeze and seize billions in known Libyan assets, especially through the LIA. The U.S. grabbed a big chunk.
But
a huge amount just vanished, especially the physical assets, like a lot of that gold.
Vanished how? Stolen. Hidden better.
All sorts of theories. Smuggled out across Libya's borders in the chaos. Hidden away in secret bunkers, maybe still undiscovered. Some even say buried out in the desert somewhere.
Buried gold. Sounds like something out of a movie.
Doesn't it? But the reality was Libya descended into civil war and chaos after Gaddafi, trying to conduct a systematic search for hidden assets in that environment. almost impossible.
So we're talking billions, maybe tens of billions, and tons of gold. Just lost, unaccounted for.
The estimates are all over the place, but yeah. Some reports suggest over $30 billion in Libyan funds are still missing, and the gold. Who knows? Scattered across the globe in private hands, still hidden in Libya, it's one of the big remaining mysteries.
It's just mind-boggling. This enormous, hidden financial empire built on oil, used for himself, used to bribe and fund conflicts.
It really is. The Gaddafi story is, I think, a stark example of how someone with absolute power can build and hide just extraordinary wealth, operating completely outside the normal rules.
So for you listening, when you think about this scale, this global reach, it really makes you question how possible it is for individuals to operate outside financial systems. And what does that mean for stability, for getting Libya's assets back?
What are the long-term consequences? It's a story that definitely invites you to look harder at sovereign wealth, sure, but also international finance, how power works, and the messy legacies these kinds of regimes leave behind. There's still so much.
Welcome to this deep dive. We take the sources you're interested in and, well, we pull out the key stuff.
Yeah, what really matters.
Exactly. And today, we're digging into something, a question I think a lot of people wonder about. How does a country with so many resources end up poor and, politically unstable?
It's a classic tragic story, unfortunately.
Our mission today is to unpack the rule of Mobutu Sese Seko. He ran the Democratic Republic of Congo, which he renamed Zaire, for a long time.
Yeah, we're basically trying to understand a huge story of corruption, power, and, frankly, decades of deception.
So the timeline we're looking at is Mobutu seizing power in 1965 after independence and some rocky years.
Right, a lot of instability then.
And he stays in power until 1997. And you mentioned the name changed to Zaire. That was part of his whole authenticity idea, trying to shed the colonial past. Symbolically, at least.
Exactly. A big part of his initial consolidation of power.
Okay, let's get into it. The first thing that really jumps out from the sources is this massive effort Mobutu made to build his own image, this cult of personality.
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't just being president. He styled himself as the Leopard of Zaire, this sort of father figure for everyone.
And it wasn't subtle, was it?
Not at all. And what's really striking is how systematic it was. This wasn't some organic thing. It was completely engineered to keep him in control.
How so?
Well, his picture was literally everywhere. Statues, huge portraits in all the government buildings, even, private shops and businesses had to display it.
Wow. So unavoidable.
Pretty much. It created this feeling that Mobutu was there. So questioning him, that felt like questioning the nation itself. It wasn't just ego. It was about making sure people wouldn't dare challenge him. A psychological thing.
Building that unquestioning loyalty.
And that kind of propaganda, it digs deep. It can shape a country's political culture for generations.
Yeah, I can see that. And it wasn't just pictures, right? The sources mentioned schools, media.
The whole system.
Yeah.
Schools taught his ideology. The news glorified him constantly. Even the arts were pushed to celebrate him. Absolute loyalty was the demand.
So here's the crucial link then. How did this image, this carefully built persona, allow for the massive personal enrichment?
Well, the image was the perfect cover. It provided the smokescreen, this distraction, while the real business of his rule went on, which was essentially looting the country.
He basically treated Zaire like his personal property.
Completely. He funneled state funds into his own accounts, used state companies for his own gain. I mean, he became one of the richest people on the planet while Zaire just got poorer and poorer.
It's staggering when you think about what Zaire actually has. The natural wealth is immense. Cobalt, copper, diamonds, gold. I mean, it should be a rich country.
The treasure trove, yeah. But that wealth didn't build the nation. It built Mobutu's bank accounts.
So how did that work mechanically? How did the resources become tools for him?
Well, looking into it, you see, he set up this whole network. He put his loyal buddies, his cronies, in charge of the mining sectors. So the goal wasn't, let's develop Zaire. It was, how do we get this money into our pockets? Often offshore accounts hidden away.
Right. The kind of places with strict banking secrecy. Makes it almost impossible to get back.
Exactly. And that's the classic resource curse, isn't it? The very wealth that could save a country ends up trapping it because of corruption and weak government. Zaire's a textbook case.
And it wasn't just Mobutu and his circle acting alone. The sources really point a finger at foreign companies, too, from Belgium, France, the U.S.
Yes, that's a really important and maybe uncomfortable part of the story. These corporations got amazing access to Zaire's resources.
Favorable terms, minimal regulation.
Pretty much. And the benefits for the actual Congolese people, almost zero. It was exploitation, pure and simple.
So there was a kind of deal being done. Support from Mobutu in exchange for access.
That's the quid pro quo, yeah. He gave them access, political favor, and in return, they helped keep him looking legitimate, or at least didn't cause trouble. But the cost was huge.
For the people, you mean?
Yeah. Terrible working conditions, massive environmental damage, and just the fundamental injustice of seeing your country's wealth shipped away.
And beyond the anti-communist angle, Western governments often just wanted those strategic minerals, didn't they?
Absolutely. Cobalt, especially, was vital. So geopolitical needs, short-term gains, kind of trumped concerns about Mobutu's rule. It's a difficult ethical trade-off, looking back.
And the sources mention oil, too, not just minerals, around Lake Tanganyika.
Yeah, the Congo oil connection. It's the same story, different resource. Multinationals, Mobutu's inner circle, making huge profits. Local people living right there, still poor.
Just another layer of the same extraction model.
Exactly. Which brings us to something called Zairianization. This is fascinating and very deceptive.
Okay, what was that about?
Well, on paper, it sounded great. Nationalistic. Take businesses owned by foreigners and give them to Congolese people. Empowering the nation, right?
That's good. Like
Yeah.
taking back control of the economy.
That was the spin. But the reality, the sources are clear. The real goal was just to give these businesses to Mobutu's friends and allies. Cement his power even further.
So not empowering the average Congolese person at all.
Not remotely. Foreign businesses were taken over, sure, but they just got handed to the loyalists.
And the result was?
Predictable, really. Mismanagement everywhere. Corruption went through the roof, and the economy, instead of growing, was crippled.
So a policy that sounded like nationalism was just another tool for personal gain.
Precisely, a really stark example of that.
Now, holding all this together, the corruption,
yeah.
the image,
They-
required muzzle, right?
Yeah.
The military.
Oh, definitely. Mobutu poured money into the military, not necessarily to make it effective at, say, defending borders.
But effective at control.
Exactly. It was loyal to him, well-funded, and absolutely brutal. Its main job was crushing any dissent, any hint of opposition.
It was basically an instrument of fear.
A very tangible one. Protests, calls for reform, they were met with violence. The sources talk about killings, torture, people being forced from their homes. The human cost was immense.
And this suppression, it wasn't hidden, was it? He ruled with an iron fist.
No, not at all. Political opponents, journalists trying to report the truth, activists. If you spoke out, you were in danger. Prison, torture, assassination. These were real risks.
And yet, and this is the part that's hard to reconcile, on the world stage, he was painting himself as what?
As the West's best friend in Africa. A key ally against communism. That's the incredible contradiction.
Brutal dictator at home, anti-communist hero abroad.
That's how he played it. And he played it very skillfully, navigating the Cold War politics, which leads us to that international complicity again.
Right. It's tough to look at, but the sources show Western powers, the U.S., France especially, propping him up for decades.
The Cold War context was everything. He was their guy against the Soviets in the region.
So his terrible record,
Yeah.
the corruption, the human rights abuses, that just got overlooked.
Yeah. It seems that way, largely. The strategic goal of stopping communism seemed more important at the time.
And the U.S. provided actual aid. Money, military support.
Yes, substantial financial and military assistance, which, directly helped keep his regime in power. It's a sobering look at how geopolitics can override concerns for people's basic rights.
It really makes you think about the interplay between that carefully crafted image and the actual mechanics of corruption.
They fed each other, definitely. The image provided cover, and the stolen wealth funded the apparatus that maintained the image and suppressed dissent.
But it couldn't last forever, right? What started to chip away at his power?
Well, eventually things started to unravel, especially in the 1990s. Decades of stealing and mismanagement finally caught up. The economy was a wreck.
And global conditions changed.
Right. Commodity prices fell, which hit Zaire hard. Plus, people inside the country were getting bolder, dissent was growing, and then the big one, the Cold War ended.
Ah, so his value as an anti-communist ally just evaporated?
Pretty much overnight. Suddenly, his Western backers weren't so keen to ignore the downsides of his rule. He wasn't indispensable anymore.
The ground shifted under him.
Completely. The foundations just crumbled. By 1997, a rebellion led by Laurent Kabila finally pushed him out.
And Zaire became the Democratic Republic of Congo again. The end of an era.
A very long, very dark era.
But the impact, It didn't just end when he left power, did it? The sources paint a pretty grim picture of his legacy.
Grimm's putting it mildly. It's a legacy of betrayal, corruption on an unimaginable scale, exploitation. The Congolese people paid a terrible price.
Resources looted, economy shattered.
And more than that, the political and social fabric of the country was torn apart. Those divisions, that fragmentation, you still see the effects today.
So the poverty, the conflicts, the instability in the DRC now, a lot of that traces back to Mobutu's time.
Absolutely. The systemic corruption, the weakening of institutions, the culture of impunity, he left incredibly deep scars. If you want to understand the challenges the DRC faces today, you really have to understand the Mobutu years.
So wrapping this up, the key takeaway from this deep dive feels, well, quite stark. Mobutu's rule is this cautionary tale, isn't it?
A powerful one. It shows just how destructive unchecked power and corruption can be, especially when you've got all those natural resources that should be making people prosperous.
It really makes you think.
And maybe here's something for you, the listener, to consider. How might international politics, global economic interests, how might they still be, perhaps subtly, propping up or undermining governments in developing countries today?
Right. What are the less obvious ways that might still be happening even after the Cold War?
Yeah. It's worth reflecting on those dynamics.